Corporate Carney just doesn't stop, does he? Welcome back to the last word on Bakes on Things. I hope you had a great Monday. Let's kick things off by talking about Mr. Corporate Carney today because as more and more Canadians are starting to call him, Corporate Carney is all about business. Now, if you've been paying attention, since he took office in April, you'll notice something very strange about Mark Carney. Every time Canadians ask him about people, he answers about profits. Every time he's pressed about families, he pivots to firms. Every time Pierre Poilievre corners him in question period about groceries, housing, or jobs, Carney turns it into a seminar about business investment and U.S. tariffs. And you know what? It's not an accident. It's a pattern. And we're going to take a look. Let's go.
Welcome to Bakes on Things.
Welcome back to Bakes on Things, the last word. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and of course, join the thoughts down below. Boy, you guys were a little sensitive about the first sip this morning, weren't you, some of you? Holy cow. Now, some of those comments did say, why are you upset about the U.S. investing in their own lithium project, which happens to be in Nevada? That's not what they invested in. They invested in the Canadian company that has that project in Nevada, and they invested 5%. And I actually have no problem whatsoever with the U.S. investing in that. What I do have a problem with is the fact that we didn't make this part of our negotiations. The fact that Mark Carney didn't see this as an opportunity to say, hey guys, let's invest in both of each other's companies. Let's become a North American superpower. And when we do that, we don't need to tariff the hell out of each other because we're both going to profit. But he didn't do that, and that was my problem. So hopefully we didn't offend this morning. But since becoming Prime Minister, Mark Carney has held over a dozen major press conferences and PMO briefings. And here's the shocking truth. The vast majority of those weren't about helping regular Canadians at all. They were about trade, business competitiveness, and foreign investment. Now, out of at least 13 national press conferences, only 2 were clearly focused on housing affordability, one announcing a so-called middle-class tax cut, and another promoting the Build Canada Homes initiative, which, by the way, is still mostly tied up in red tape and unspent funding. Everything else? Well, he's always talking corporate speak and boardroom jargon. Let's take a few examples, okay? So this is something that I think we need to point out to our liberal friends, so feel free to share this video. But back in May, when Carney was asked directly about record grocery prices, the very issue hammering Canadians every single week of their lives, what did he do? He dodged that question entirely and pivoted to talking about supply chain resilience and food processing investments. He told reporters he was focused on ensuring Canadian business remains globally competitive in essential sectors. Well, that wasn't the question mark. And all that sounds nice in an MBA presentation, but it doesn't help the single mom staring down a $12 bag of chicken. In June, when the opposition pressed him on job losses in manufacturing towns like Windsor and Sarnia, Ontario, Carney once again flipped it again. Instead of addressing workers losing their paychecks, he started talking about long-term reskilling programs and building a sustainable industrial business base. He went straight back to the businesses. He actually said, and this is a direct quote from Mark Carney, Canada's prosperity depends on creating the right environment for business confidence. True, but that was not the question. Not jobs, not wages. He didn't talk about either of those, just business confidence. That's Corporate Carney in a nutshell. It's all he knows. He can't relate to you as a Canadian. Because look again in July. Canadians were furious about rising housing costs. Renters were being gouged. First-time homebuyers completely shut out of everything. Poilievre recently asked him point blank in the House of Commons, I think last week, what is your plan to make housing affordable for everyday Canadians? And what did Carney do yet again? He ignored the question and pivoted to talking about public-private financing tools and investment vehicles for large developers. You could practically hear every young Canadian who's ever dreamed of buying a home rolling their eyes when he said it. Because that's what Carney does best. He treats every real world problem like a capital market. If you're hungry, he'll tell you about grocery sector investment. If you can't find a home, he'll talk about financial frameworks. If you're broke, he'll talk about long-term competitiveness of our businesses. Even his so-called affordability measures sound like something that was cooked up in some consulting firm. His middle class tax relief, the one where you get $90 a year. Yeah, that announcement, not so great. The average Canadian got just under $100, as we've said, total for the year. Meanwhile, Carney held a joint press conference with the CEO of one of Canada's largest banks, praising public-private alignment and market confidence. Well, markets don't eat. That's not leadership at all. That is corporate brand management, and it's all he knows how to do. When are Liberals going to get this? And let's not forget how he handled the tariffs. In September, when asked about the growing strain in Canada-US trade relations, particularly tariffs on steel, aluminum, and agriculture, what did Carney do? He went on a 5-minute full-on off-filled lecture about North American economic integration and mutual business opportunity with no actual results or anything to present. Reporters tried to bring him back to what those tariffs mean for Canadian workers, truckers, and farmers, the individuals that you are watching this, but he refused to touch that. It was all about the numbers, the charts, the trade flows, not the people living with the actual consequences of these Liberal decisions. Even Liberal insiders are starting to actually notice. A few Liberal backbenchers have quietly started admitting that Carney rarely connects emotionally with his voters and almost always talks like he's at a G7 finance roundtable in press conferences. Conservative MPs have been even louder about it, of course, calling him the banker's prime minister. Pierre Poilievre himself said in a committee hearing, Mark Carney talks like every Canadian is a balance sheet, but Canadians are human beings, not assets. And that was a committee hearing a while ago, but still, it's true. And you know what? He's right. This obsession with business metrics over human outcomes is exactly why so many Canadians feel completely unheard. Carney keeps insisting that a strong economy lifts everyone. But the problem is, he never defines what that actually means. Because to him, the economy is GDP, trade balances, investment flow. To most Canadians, the economy is whether they can afford their own home still, whether their grocery cart fits their paycheck this week, and whether their kids have a decent future. That's the economy to most Canadians, and that is the disconnect between Mark Carney and the average everyday Canadian. Mark Carney doesn't talk like a prime minister. He talks like a corporate keynote speaker. Every issue is filtered through the lens of business. Every policy is about investor confidence. Every answer is polished, precise, and utterly devoid of any empathy whatsoever. Now, some of his defenders try to argue that this is all part of a long game for the economy. They'll say, hey, give it time. If Carney helps business, that will eventually trickle down to everyone else. They claim that attracting more investment will create jobs, which would be true, and we'll get to that in a second, and that business growth will eventually make life easier for the average Canadian. I don't disagree with most of that, but here's the problem. None of that is actually happening. He talks about it, but none of it is happening. Here we are 6 months in. There's almost no movement on any of these so-called corporate strategies he keeps babbling on about. The big foreign investment funds Carney's promised still aren't here, nor a sniff of them coming. Still stuck in committee reviews, some of them. The Canada Competitiveness Plan he announced back in May, there's no legislation for that. The so-called public-private infrastructure partnerships, not a single shovel in the ground. The only thing that's working are the projects that were already underway that he put under the projects office. All we've had are press releases, panels, polished speeches, but not one tangible result for everyday Canadians. So even if the corporate Carney trickle-down theory were true in some fantasy world, the tap hasn't even been turned on. It's not even dripping. There's nothing trickling down because there's nothing moving forward. 6 months and nothing is moving forward. And those projects, again, were already underway. And while Bay Street crowd gets cocktail receptions and roundtables with Carney, Canadians get higher rents, record grocery prices, and zero relief. The only thing that's trickling down right now is Canadian frustration. In fact, many of his own allies are starting to worry. Business leaders are growing impatient with Carney. They've praised his tone, but they quietly admit backroom stories that execution is still non-existent. One Liberal MP has even said privately, we found out, that Mark's talking like a central banker again, all analysis, no action. A Liberal MP. That's exactly it. They're right. Carney's government is all PowerPoint, no progress. All rhetoric, no results. So when you hear him promise that stronger businesses will lift all Canadians, remember this. There's nothing being built other than the projects he put into the project office that are already well underway. Nothing being implemented and nothing helping the average person in Canada. The so-called tide he's talking about isn't rising. It's all just talk. Now, sure, there's nothing wrong with being pro-business. We need businesses in this country. That's not what I'm saying. But the job of a prime minister isn't to protect balance sheets for businesses. It's to protect the people of this country. And right now, Canadians don't feel protected. They feel ignored. They feel sold out to a government that thinks in terms of profit margins instead of paychecks. And that's why the Liberal Corporate Carney seems to be sticking now, because it's true. Canadians don't need another economist telling them how to be patient. They need a leader who looks them in the eye and says, I get it. Life in this country is hard. Here's what we're going to do to fix it. And then actually do it. Instead, Carney smirks his way through tariff charts and trade graphs like he's talking to an audience of investors, not voters. So the next time you hear Mark Carney talk about competitiveness or industrial alignment, remember what he's really saying here. He's saying he cares more about the corporations than he does Canadians. And there's a good chance he's invested in many of them. He's saying that the struggles of ordinary people are a side note to the next global trade meeting. And Canadians deserve so much better than that. This country doesn't need a prime minister who acts like a corporate consultant. It needs one who acts like a neighbor, like they're right next door to you, helping you. Someone who understands that not everything in life can be solved by an Excel spreadsheet. That sometimes leadership actually means some empathy, not economic jargon. And it also means we need action. So yes, Mark Carney has earned his nickname. He is Corporate Carney. And it's time Canadians started calling him that to his face because he doesn't seem to notice. And if you look at Champagne's announcement today, where it wasn't really an announcement, it was like, get ready for our budget. It's going to look really different because investments versus expenses. He tried to use an example today of, you know how your phone bill is an expense, but buying a home is an investment? That's what the budget's going to look like. Here's the problem, Mr. Champagne. If you can't afford a home, don't spend on it. That's the point. So yes, buying a home may be an investment. But guess what? Doesn't matter. If you're taking it out of the budget with money you do not have, and you're spending beyond your means with money you do not have, that's the problem. Not the fact that buying a home is an investment. Terrible example, and this is how the Liberals always do it. Anyway, thanks for joining us here on The Last Word. I am thrilled that you joined us, and I had a good Monday, hopefully. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and of course, send your thoughts into the comments down below. Let's have a discussion about this. Are you really seeing this Corporate Carney? I mean, 13 press releases and only 2 about actual Canadian citizens. Everything else about business. You can't make this stuff up. We'll see you tomorrow morning on The First Sip at 6 a.m. Have a great evening.